new year. This year, Nature Revisited is celebrating the beginning of its 9th year of sharing interviews, stories, and conversations that connect us to our natural environment, to nature. Nature Revisited is very proud of the voices we have shared with you, our listeners. If there is one thing that I have learned from doing the podcast, it is that there is an amazing amount of people and organizations around the world who are trying to make a difference as we face an uncertain future. Nature Revisited is looking forward to sharing more of those voices as we look forward to the new year and beyond. On this episode of Nature Revisited, we are pleased to welcome Amorina Kingdon, author of the book Sing Like Fish, to the podcast. Amorina is a science journalist and fiction writer who has worked as a staff writer and researcher for Hakai Magazine, where she covered the ocean and coastal science from around the world. Sing Like Fish is a book driven by the emerging science that is showing us how many animals rely on and are impacted by sound underwater. That the ocean is not and never has been a silent place. Amorina introduces us to the soundscape of the sea, a mysterious place that marine biologists are just beginning to understand. Amorina joins me from her home in Vancouver, British Columbia, to talk about the sounds and songs of the ocean. So Amorina, welcome to Nature Revisited. It's a pleasure having you on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I love the title of the podcast.
Why, thank you. So let's start with, when did you first discover that the silent world of the oceans isn't so silent, and that you wanted to better understand the sounds beneath the waves?
Well, the first time that I think understood that sound underwater was a very different beast was when I was sent up to Cook Inlet in Alaska on assignment for Hakai Magazine, which is a magazine that's based here in British Columbia, but we cover coastal science all around the world. I went up to Alaska and I was writing a story about beluga whales. I was out on a Zodiac, which is a little inflatable boat that scientists use to cruise around the coast. I was sitting on this Zodiac in the middle of this pod of whales, and they were making all these sounds kind of above the water, like chirps and little whistles. The scientists that I was with explained that they've actually been known for centuries by sailors as the canaries of the sea for how loud they are above the water. And then he said, if you listen below the water, they're actually making a lot of sounds underwater too. I kind of had this abstract knowledge that whales made sound underwater. I think, like a lot of people, we're very biased towards our own senses. So if you stick your head in the water, sound is a bit garbled, it's kind of faint, and we just don't really think about it that much. He put a hydrophone in the water. He had a little speaker on board that was playing the sounds that the whales were making under the waves. This entirely different sounds come out of the speaker. There was clicks and buzzes and whoops and whistles. At the same time that I was hearing this, I was also looking at the water itself. Cook Inlet is kind of a really interesting place because the water there is almost opaque with silt. So you can't really see. If you were to go underwater in Cook Inlet, there's no visibility at all. So if you imagine being a whale in the water, you're essentially blind. He explained that the whales have to use a different sense in order to navigate, to see their way around underwater. He said they rely on sound really heavily to stay away from the mud flats and avoid getting stranded. It was this really kind of visceral experience of how acoustic these animals really were. Not just that sound actually does work well, it's that in a lot of places it actually works better than light. And animals that live in the ocean actually have to rely on sound in a way that animals above the waves don't. And we humans just kind of don't hear it because our ears aren't designed to pick up on it.
Your book really touches on sound. What is the difference between noise and sound? And when does noise become harmful?
That's a really good question. The definition of noise changes a little bit depending on who you ask. Generally speaking, when you're talking about acoustics, noise is an unwanted sound. Often it's also something that interferes with an important signal. So something that's noise to one animal cannot be noise to another. And something that's noise to me might not be noise to you. Generally speaking, if you have a sound that's broadband, that's drowning out important contact calls, or that's interfering with your ability to pick up on what you're trying to listen for that's important, that becomes noise. When you're studying animals underwater, it's really important to know not only what sounds or what noises are they hearing, but also what's their sensitivity, what kind of sounds mean different things to them. For example, a lot of fish hear at lower frequency sounds. So a very high-pitched sound that could be noise to, say, a dolphin doesn't bother a fish at all. And then vice versa. It's a little bit of a squidgy term, but generally speaking, noise is an unwanted sound that interferes with an important signal.
So what is a hydrophone and what is it used for?
A hydrophone is essentially a microphone, but it's specifically designed to work in water. Because air is so much less dense than water, that's just going to look different and carry energy differently. And so a microphone that you might be using for podcasting, that's going to be designed to pick up on sound waves that are transmitted in the air. Whereas underwater, because water is so much denser, you need to have a device that's sort of designed to pick up on how a sound wave would move through that denser medium. Essentially what a hydrophone lets you do is hear sound underwater the way that an animal that lives in the water would hear it, which has been invaluable for research and pretty much every other application that uses sound underwater.
So in the beginning of the book, you introduce us to Kieran Cox. Who is Kieran Cox and why is he studying kelp?
Kieran Cox was the first person who ever mentioned to me that fish make sounds. When I realized that I was going to be writing a book, I went back and sent him a note and said, I think I need to have a longer chat with you. I remember I was out on a research trip with him once up on the central coast of British Columbia, and we were out at the crack of dawn. I don't think the sun was even up yet. He mentioned that he was working on a project called the British Columbia Fish Sounds Project. I caught up with him when I realized that I was going to be working on a deeper project looking at the whole world of sound underwater. I said, so how did that fish sound project go? And he was still working on underwater sounds. He was looking specifically at how sound and noise move through kelp forests. And that was really important because kelp forests are one of those underwater ecosystems that covers about a third of the world's temperate coasts, and a lot of animals live there. They're kind of like coral reefs. They're very rich. They're very important for ocean health. A lot of species raise their young there. They congregate there. And so what he wanted to know was, how does sound move through kelp forests? And does the kelp, like the seaweed, the large seaweed, does it help muffle or absorb any of the noise that happens along a lot of coasts from ships and boats? When I was able to go out with them, I was able to see how scientists actually do a lot of this field research, which when you think about it is a little logistically tricky. You have to be able to scuba dive, you have to be able to drive a boat, you have to be able to operate hydrophones and use equipment underwater. The overarching thing that I got from my trip out with Kieran was that even scientists that don't strictly study sound, even scientists that aren't acousticians, they don't specialize in it, if you're in the ocean, you kind of need to consider sound as an aspect of your work, almost like the way you'd consider water temperature or type of coast you're on. It's a huge factor of the environment. And so what I'm finding with scientists like Kieran is that even though they're not strictly speaking sound scientists, they're still learning to start to include sound in their work because they realize it's such an important aspect of animal lives underwater. So that's kind of a paradigm shift in science because what's happening is a lot of scientists are suddenly thinking, as I'm studying this species or I'm looking at this area, I should actually probably be measuring the sound as well, or at least listening to what the hearing range of the species I'm studying is, because they're starting to realize that sound is really important for these animals.
Can you talk about the different ways we think species might experience sound underwater, such as through communications and language?
If you want to look at it through a biological lens, which is what I did in this book, in order to survive, there's a list of things that an animal has to do. It has to find food, it has to navigate, it has to find a mate if it's going to reproduce sexually, or it has to find a good place to settle. It has to communicate with its social group if it's a social animal. There's all these things that any animal anywhere have to do in order to survive. One of the things that we're discovering is that for many, probably most animals underwater, they lean on sound for most of those things. For example, listening for predators and prey. A lot of animals have specialized hearing in water so that they can listen for where predators and prey are rather than using their sight. For a lot of animals that are social, they use sound to communicate in what are called contact calls so that they can stay in touch with each other and hear where each other are. And some of those contact calls can get pretty complicated. Dolphins can even use contact calls that are specific to them, very much like a name, which is very cool. Then there's animals that use sound to help navigate or find food with echolocation, which is using pings of sound and then listening for the echoes, mapping out the space around you using sound as opposed to what we humans do, which is use sight. One of the big things that people are discovering is that animals, pretty much any animal in water, whether it makes a sound or not, knows how to detect sound and can listen to sound. Even if it doesn't have an ear, sound is so important underwater that even little corals, octopuses, animals that you wouldn't think of as having any business with sound, they have ways of detecting it. So just listening is a big way that animals use sound. Using song or contact calls to stay in touch and communicate with each other. Then there's also just using sound to send other communication signals, like some animals will use sound to fight with each other. If you can think of a facet of survival that has to happen in the water, chances are animals are using sound to do it.
Can you give us a little deeper understanding of echolocation and its significance?
Echolocation is essentially an animal will produce a sound, usually a click, listening for the echo of that sound off of whatever's around it. And then based on how long that click takes to return, the shape of the click or how the sound wave might have changed after bouncing off whatever's around it, the animal then listens to the returning echo and judges what's going on around it. It's active, so the animal will make the sound in order to send out a beam of clicks to see what's around it. It can be used wherever there's no or little visibility. Marine mammals have evolved the use of echolocation because sound is a more reliable sense to see the space around them than light is. What they'll do is they'll use that to see where the bottom is or where there's a rock, but they'll also usually use it for hunting. What you find with a lot of marine mammals, for example, around here in British Columbia, they'll use an echolocation click and they'll find a prey animal like a fish. They will send out a beam of clicks and they'll listen to the echoes. And based on how those echoes come back, they can tell how big the animal is. They can tell if it's moving closer away from them. They can tell if it's moving up or down. And then they'll zoom in or they'll zero in on the animal and they'll be able to pinpoint its location and grab it with their jaws. One of the more amusing recordings from hydrophones that I've heard is actually of beluga whales hunting using echolocation. You can hear the clicks that they're making on the hydrophone. And a lot of the time you can tell if they were successful in their hunt because what happens is you hear like a click, 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 and it speeds up till it becomes basically a buzz noise because the clicks are getting closer together because the beluga is getting closer to the prey animal. And then it ends with this chomp noise that basically indicates that the beluga's caught the fish. Essentially, it's a way of using sound to see and to return information about the world around you when sight and other senses are just not as reliable. And that actually happens a lot in the ocean because often ocean water is kind of murky. You can't see very well. And then if you go to any significant depths in the ocean, just the physics of the way that water absorbs light, even if the water is really, really clear, it still gets dark pretty shallow. Using sound to see around you is a really good strategy for marine mammals, especially when they're trying to hunt prey.
So we all know that whales have song. How would you define theirs and other marine animals' songs? And does song indicate culture or language?
Well, that's a big question, but I'll do my best. There's a lot of differing opinions about what those words mean depending on what field of study you're in. Culture as a word is kind of thought of as a different set of criteria among, say, biologists than it is among people who study social sciences. When scientists first started to understand that whales, specifically humpback whales, were making song or making these sounds, they leaned on a lot of studies that had been done in the 1930s by bird scientists. So it was well understood at that point that birds have something that we'd call a song. What they did was when they discovered whales were making sounds that were kind of similar, they said, well, does it match the criteria of song as laid out by the bird people? But essentially they said, even in the strictest definition, song is a series of notes, generally of more than one type, uttered in succession and so related as to form recognizable sequence or pattern in time. So when you look what the whale sounds were, clearly that conformed to that definition. And so the scientists who were studying the whales said, well, if birds are singing, then so are whales because they're doing the same thing. And in fact, if you take a bird song and slow it down, or you take a whale song and you speed it up, to a fairly untrained ear, they sound very, very similar. By most definitions, song is defined by its sequence and by the pattern in the notes. It's not defined by how much information it's carrying. So to be a song, it kind of just has to be patterned. It doesn't necessarily have to have an intrinsic message that it's carrying or a signal that it's carrying. It just kind of is itself. In that way, song is a little bit different from something like a contact call or from language or anything that we'd call language, because it's not actually saying anything, it's just existing as itself. Leaving aside the question of language, which is a whole other kettle of fish, the idea of culture is one of those things, again, that the definitions can get squidgy either way, but generally speaking, a good degree of whale scientists and people who study this sort of thing, they look at the existence of song in whales, and they also look at some of the social bonds and the way that the whales communicate with each other and define their groups with dialect. They say that by most definitions, you would call that a culture. And so song is often used as one of the elements that scientists will cite when they point at whales and say they seem to have something we call a culture. I'm certainly not qualified to say 100% for sure, one way or the other. I think that whatever you decide to label it, it's absolutely remarkable that these animals seem to be able to remember songs that can go on for, in some cases, almost days. And they sing the same sequence in the same parts of the world over and over again. So it speaks to an incredible amount of ability and skill just on the part of the animal to be able to make these songs, regardless of what you want to call it.
So who is William Holliday, and what are soundscapes?
William Holliday is a scientist that I met a couple of years ago who is studying soundscapes in the Canadian Arctic. He actually goes up into the Arctic and goes out to camps, and he's working right now to record soundscapes in the Arctic ecosystems. That is an extremely challenging thing to do, just logistically. Going up into the Arctic often requires extremely expensive flights, very weather-driven trips, shifty ice conditions. But it's really important that that data be gathered, and it's important that that data be gathered now, which is why he's trying to do it. He's certainly not the only person doing it, but he's another one of the people that I came across here in Victoria who is trying to get that data. And the reason that's important is because the Arctic is one of the last few places on Earth where the ocean ecosystem is relatively, not completely, but relatively, still in many places close to the baseline of what it is without human impact. In a lot of places, there's no ship noise, there's no boat noise, there's no sonar. It's a place where you can still go and get a good, what scientists call a baseline reading of what it's like in the ocean for animals. And in a lot of places in the world, especially when it comes to acoustics, that's just not possible anymore. We really started to look at sound underwater pretty recently. And by the time we really started to listen underwater, we were already making quite a lot of noise of a nature that you just can't really turn off. So you can hear ship noise in pretty much every ocean in the world. You can hear ship noise at the bottom of the Mariana Trench. We will probably never really be able to put a hydrophone in the Pacific Ocean and hear no ship noise. Sea ice is retreating fairly quickly, and as the ocean opens up, that changes the soundscape or the sounds of the ocean. Just on a natural basis, there's more wind and wave noise. And then there's plans to have more shipping through the Arctic, which is going to introduce more ship noise. There's already an influx of tourism and cruise ships into the Arctic. What scientists like Will Halliday are doing is they're trying to kind of get that baseline data of what's it like, what's the sound, what are the animals adapted to before all that happens. As for what a soundscape is, it's a holistic picture of all the sounds in a particular place. The reason why that's important is because for a lot of studies or a lot of animals, scientists will go into an area and they'll record one specific things. With a soundscape, it's a slightly different approach. And what it is it's recording the ambient sound in an area and how all those sounds can fit and work together. And it's a concept that came out of some recording that was done in the middle of the century by scientists like Bernie Krause, and before that, musicians like Murray Schafer. And they basically looked at it from a more holistic behavioral point of view. And they said, in order to really understand what an animal's doing or to understand why their life looks the way that it does, you kind of have to understand the world that they're in. You want to understand everything that they're responding to. You can listen to the soundscape of an area and say, I can hear the calls of these fish. I can hear the calls of these whales. Soundscape is essentially like a landscape for sound. What it can do is it can tell you a different set of facts or a different set of information about a particular area, more so than just going in and listening for one thing or studying just one animal.
What are we beginning to learn about the complexity of how creatures are able to communicate with sound beneath the waves?
I think what we're beginning to learn is that animals underwater can be just as complex as animals in the air, in the forest. And again, I think it's simply that we didn't realize how well sound worked in water for so long. So we had this bias that the ocean was a silent world. What we're realizing now is it's not. We just don't hear very well in water. The other facet of that I think is really interesting is we kind of knew that whales made a lot of interesting sounds. We knew that dolphins and killer whales made some very interesting sounds. But what I think is so interesting is that more than 90% of the species in the ocean are not vertebrates. They're invertebrates. They're animals who are single-celled organisms. We would never think of them as being acoustic. They don't have structures that we would call an ear. And yet, what we're finding is that even they are able to detect sound, they respond to sound, and then fish, which is a whole huge group of animals that I never thought of as being acoustic. Not only do they hear very well, in some cases they hear very well, but they also make a huge diversity of sounds. A rough estimate is that probably somewhere around north of 30% of all fish species that we've listened to have some form of sound that they make. And that can be something like grunts or hums or trills or clicks but they make sounds. They're very vocal. I should correct myself there. I shouldn't use the word vocal because a scientist would tell me that only something that has a voice box can make a vocalization. But the variety of ways that fish can make sounds and have evolved to do so is really stunning when you actually look and listen to them. I come from a marine science background. I was studying this stuff for years. I was reporting on it. Even I didn't really connect the dots until, well, when I started to think about the book seriously, which was only about 10 years ago.
So what are some of the effects that the increase in commerce, such as freight shipping, cruise ships, and wind turbines, having on the life beneath the waves?
That is a really good question. What scientists will do is kind of divide underwater human-made noise up into two broad categories. And one of them is something that they kind of think of as impulsive sounds. And those are loud, short, sharp shock noises. And those are things like using seismic air guns for imaging underwater, for example, or if you're using naval sonar, that's very, very loud. And these noises sort of fall under the category of things that could actually harm an animal or could actually hurt an animal in some cases. Most scientists would say that the lower chronic, ongoing, constant noises that come from shipping actually are creating some of the most pervasive effect on animals in the ocean. And a lot of the time, the way that this happens, it essentially shrinks the amount of space in which you can meaningfully communicate. Because in the water, sound is the sense that goes further than light, that goes out so far and can kind of define the limits of your world, it quite literally shrinks a lot of these animals' world. If you think of a killer whale, their pulsed calls, like the calls that they use to communicate with each other, they can be heard over dozens of kilometers without too much trouble. And that's just because sound works really, really well in water. It travels quite far. It travels 4.5 times faster than it does in air. Sound is a great sense. It's a great information channel, and it goes very far. So if you think of a killer whale swimming through the Strait of Juan de Fuca right now, it's not relying on its sight to know where its family is, where a ship is, where the bottom is, where the next island is. It's relying on sound to do that over a distance of kilometers. So if you have a shipping lane there with a constant 24-hour-a-day broadband growl, shipping noise quite literally shrinks the listening space of an animal. It also can shrink the communication space. If you think back to how many different functions of life animals are using sound for, finding mates, finding prey, staying in touch with each other, you see how easily it can lead to animals getting separated from each other. If you think about it, whales don't have arms. They can't actually hold their babies. And so when they're born, they're very dependent on their mothers. They have to keep their babies close or else they can be predated on or they can be lost. They can starve. And the way that they do that is often with sound. So mothers and calves will often make low-pitched contact calls to each other, kind of constantly back and forth to stay in touch. In places where there's a lot of calving grounds, if you have noise, what it can do is it can interfere with the ability of moms and calves to hear each other. And those calls are often a lot quieter than normal calls because they don't want to attract too much attention. So what you can have in some situations, you can get separation of moms and babies, and then the babies can't survive because they don't know where the moms are. They don't know how to call for them. They can't hear them.
So at the end of your book, you share with the reader different ways that they can learn about and experience underwater sounds. What might you like to share with our listeners who are also interested in aquatic sounds?
I would say if you do a search for live hydrophones, to my absolute delight, there are more and more places around the world that are setting out hydrophones in the water that are permanent installations, and they simply stream that sound 24/7 to the internet. There's many of them. The Orca Conservancy here in BC, Ocean Networks Canada. If you're looking for a quick and easy access to data from the ocean, thankfully, we're starting to get a lot more places that do stuff like that. You can actually hear what it sounds like in the water. You can pick up something called a dip hydrophone, and you can take it out with you into nature. You can take it out when you're kayaking or canoeing, or you can set out a recorder. It kind of looks like a little GoPro, and then you can bring it back and listen to what you recorded over time. As technology gets better, you can get more and more information on those sorts of devices, or you can listen with more and more fidelity. There's a lot of places that have collected recordings of different animal sounds. Obviously the famous whales, but in a lot of cases, they've also got fish and a lot of the other animals that you wouldn't think of as making sounds. There's a BC group called fishsounds.org. Macaulay Sound Library at Cornell University has got a great collection. The New Bedford Whaling Museum has got some fantastic recordings from some of the early scientists who actually started to listen for the first time to a lot of these whales in the last century.
Why is it so important that we better understand life beneath the ocean?
I'm one of those people that thinks it's really beautiful to just be able to understand how an animal functions in the world and to see a different way of living your life. One of the most wondrous things about this whole process for me was simply realizing that there was this whole world of sense and sound that I was not privy to, that was going on around me, that animals are partaking in. And it just reminds you that there's always something new and always something you could never imagine to discover when you stop and look and listen. On a more practical level, I think in order to make any sort of meaningful regulation or any sort of meaningful policy about protecting oceans, protecting animals, or preserving the world as it exists with all of its ecosystems and all of its services, you need to be able to translate the way that nature works into some form of understanding of what are the factors that are impacted by human activity. In order to make a meaningful regulation about how far ships can go from whales, for example, you need to know over what distance the whale can hear the ship. It's not enough to just say, oh, there's whales in the area, you can't boat here. You need to know what kind of whale is it? What's its hearing range? What sorts of sounds bother it? Is it a baleen whale that hears sounds at 40 hertz, or is it a toothed whale that hears sounds at 40,000 hertz? And if so, what sort of noise is going to be problematic to it and what sort of noise isn't? Without that sort of data, you get regulation that either doesn't solve the problem that it's trying to solve, it doesn't protect the animal, or conversely, it doesn't actually have any impact at all. And if you're trying to make it so that you preserve the ocean and you protect the animals in it, you need to know how they live their lives, what sorts of things they rely on, what means what to them to the best of your ability so that you can make a meaningful regulation. If you can't bring that data to policymakers, they don't really have anything to go on. So understanding sound is important because for many animals, sound is the most important sense. It's just one of the practical things where if you want to understand how an animal is, you kind of have to understand what's important to it. And for a lot of animals in the ocean, that's sound.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Amorina Kingdon, and that you take the opportunity to read this wonderful book, Sing Like Fish, and that you visit her website, AmorinaKingdon.com, to learn more about the work she is doing. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank all of you who have followed and listened to the podcast and who have been supporting Nature Revisited for the past 6 years. Thank you. If you enjoyed this episode of Nature Revisited, please share with friends, family, and colleagues. And please rate us on your favorite podcast server. It will help us to reach a larger audience. You can follow Nature Revisited on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and on our website, nortonproductions.com. And please share your comments and suggestions for future guests for Nature Revisited on the comment section of this episode on our website. The music for this episode is The Machine in the Garden by Ben Cosgrove from his album, The Trouble with Wilderness. The Nature Revisited team consists of Stefan Van Orden, Charles Gagan, and Scott Chasky. And I hope you will join us for the next edition of Nature Revisited. And in the meantime, remember, we are nature.